Thank you for having me here. This is a really incredible and interesting group to learn about, and I hope to participate in the future. My name is Dave Elfving. I'm an adjunct professor at the California College of Art here in San Francisco. And before that, I used to work as an interaction designer and creative director at Apple's interactive marketing team. So I spent a little more than a decade helping to build product websites and the Apple Online Store and the Apple Store app and interactive experiences inside of retail stores. And I left that job in 2019 in part because I really wanted to teach. So I was excited to work with the California College of Art. So this talk I want to share with you today is sharing a little bit about what I've learned teaching with AI. I made this presentation quite short, and hopefully, actually, given what we've heard from Burton and Daryl, I actually have some positive and hopeful and exciting sort of ideas that I think we can hold on to as designers as we use tools that are empowered by AI. And if there's time, I've got another little backup presentation, or we can just give it over to conversation. Before I move on, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about this image, because I'm going to come back to it. This image I created this morning. I just logged into ChatGPT. I did not know all of Daryl's techniques for making really cool images, and I just said, show me an image of an AI teaching assistant in a college interaction design classroom. And this is pretty much the first thing that came out. I tried a few different prompts, and every time I would get this humanoid robot and something like an old school blackboard in the back. And my favorite detail here in the foreground, the little apple on the desk, this old school teacher signifier on this AI classroom. And what I immediately start to notice in this, we can almost see the stock photography that was assembled and merged to create this image. Being able to see the source material that's informing this really simple request to create an image. And I'll come back to this a little bit. So I want to start here. How many of you, I know I'm not supposed to do this, people can't see on LinkedIn, how many people are familiar with and use Figma? I get any, oh my God, look at all the hands. Right on. So I see a lot of UX, UI, prototyping people in the house. You're my family, it's good to see you. So Figma is a tool that I never got to use professionally, in part because it didn't exist, and also because collaborative tools were not something that were allowed at Apple. But Figma is something that we use on the regular at the California College of Art, where when we're teaching students how to create prototype, think through interactions, we use Figma because it's collaborative, it's rapidly becoming a pretty cool standard. And they recently announced a new feature. I saw a lot of hands, a lot of you are already nodding, you've probably seen this. They announced a new AI enhancement to Figma. So I took a little 10-second clip from their website that I think neatly encapsulates a future that my students is just inevitable. This is how they will do their work. So let's just hit play here, and we see that I get a little prompt, and I write something, make a form with filters for a recipe app, and boom, almost instantaneously, I've got the first frame of a potential app. So to me, this is incredible. Usually, it takes me maybe a week or two of working with students to get them to a place where they can think through a wireframe like this, where they're considering the space that something needs, the kind of text and supporting material they want around elements of a page, just understanding what the elements of an app or experience are. But if we look at this closer, you can start to see the templates and elements that inform this coming through, just like that first image of the robot in the classroom, right? This kind of looks like every first wireframe project prototype that my students create, because I encourage them to use existing materials as they develop their own ideas. So in some ways, this is, of course, a concern for teachers and agencies, and certainly maybe for students. Why study this stuff if you can just noodle around with prompts and have it spat out for you? Why hire an agency to do UX work for you when you can just huddle around, write up a couple prompts, and maybe send something off that works? But if we look at this closely, I think we can start to see that this is a really generic solution. So when I see this, I don't actually feel very nervous. I actually think this is potentially really powerful for designers and UX people like us. Because in a world where anyone can design anything with an AI model, Collaboration and design thinking have never been more essential. So why study? Why hire expertise? Because these are skills that take time to develop. It's taste that's built over time, and it can't be built into AI. Because design, whatever the design is, whether you're building an app, like I have my students do, maybe you're designing a cool new immersive experience for Apple's new Vision headset, whatever it is, design is not an average of patterns. It's about thoughtful, informed solutions to human problems. It can't be done well with generic patterns. If we ask for an app for managing recipes, we're going to get something really bland because it ignores the actual process of design. I tell my students that I think they have jobs in the future if they study design because AI has neither context nor taste. And that's what, did someone give me like yeah, right? AI has neither context nor taste. These are things that we can study, things that we can learn. So this is where I was actually planning a demo. We've had some cool demos here today. I was going to do a demo using Figma's new AI feature to demonstrate that it creates kind of bland solutions, but I can't because they have recently turned off this feature. Some of you may have seen this in the news. One of my favorite bloggers, John Gruber of Daring Fireball, he wrote a post called "Figma is a Ripoff Engine" because it was documented by a designer who I should have, I'll post this somewhere. Someone, a designer, used this feature and asked Figma to create a weather app. Now, anyone who works in design knows that we never start with something so broad, but asked Figma to create a weather app. And when he did this, he ended up with Apple's weather app. Like not a little bit like Apple's weather app, he ended up with Apple's weather app. And based on what we heard from the prior speakers, we know that, well, of course it's going to generate something that it's already seen because it's made out of patterns that already exist. So Figma got hit hard by this. They were called a ripoff engine. For now, they shut it down. But I actually think maybe we should be kind of cool with this and give Figma a little bit of a break and embrace, because of course it's copying patterns. Because, and all you designers, I'm going to blow your minds, I'm giving away everything. Designers have always used templates. When I introduce my students to Figma, the first thing I show them is, I think it's a little globe icon up in the corner that takes you to the Figma community. And anything you can think of, any app you'd care to create, any particular format or something, you'll find a free, maybe for pay, you'll find some templates and demos that you can use to start refining your idea. Because this is true. I encourage students to scour Figma for prior examples, useful templates. When I worked at Apple, I used a tool called OmniGraffle. Anybody remember that? I see a couple nods. All right. I had done tons and tons of work in OmniGraffle for launching products, for building online store flows. And when a new person would come to my team, overwhelmed, not sure of what to do, I would give them my prior work. Not to copy, but to build from as they solved their own problems. When I started teaching at the California College of Art, teachers gave me lesson plans, activities, whole syllabi that I could remix, because the work of teaching is not in the lesson plans or the artifacts, it's in the teaching. So this leads me to why I think we can be comfortable with tools, at least in the context of Figma and prototyping. Because wireframes and demos are not a means, they're a means towards something else. They're not an end in themselves. And I think the way that demo was presented at Figma kind of made it feel like these demos are suddenly just something you create and it's done. They're not. I tell my students that they really are important, these prototypes we're making, and yet they don't matter. They're not the thing. They're on the way to a thing. They are the visible portion of human interaction and decision making. They're artifacts of a process we can practice and a process we can teach. And that's why we go to school. That's why we hire experts. So what is this process? It's already been alluded to. It's called design thinking. Now, design thinking is long associated with design firms like IDEO. Burton's human-centered design bot is based on their principles. So you could maybe use that bot to get a primer on how to set this up for yourself. It's long associated with IDEO, but it has its roots in design research going back to the 50s and 60s. And you might see different flows, right? If you take people are taking photos, if you copy this particular approach to design thinking, if you do some research or type design thinking into Google, you'll find 50 different versions of this. What they have in common is that they are human-centered, cyclical, and non-linear. So I won't go through all of this, but the first phase is usually empathize, connect with people, define a problem after you've understood people and can see where they are encountering problems, ideate, start thinking about lots of stuff, prototype, and then test. And then you repeat this again. And depending on where you work or what kind of process you follow, they all tend to have some kind of cycle like this. And when I work with my students, I tell them at the end of the class, if you remember nothing else, if the tools we use disappear tomorrow and you go on to use something else or work in a different format or even a different industry, remember this design process because it's universal and it's something you can take with you no matter how our tools change. And if we think about how Figma and its AI tool fits into this process, it's mostly here. And this is where I think AI tools like Figma that allow rapid prototyping can be profoundly helpful here because it's informed by a process. And that's what I want to talk about in a second. We don't just go to an AI, whether it's in Figma or some future platform we haven't thought about, and just start pinging it with prompts. We want those prompts and those interactions to be part of a process because we're human beings and we're designers. That's how we develop the taste and the context that AI by itself can't provide. So in my classes, we focus on this process, our interactions with each other, and as I mentioned before, I always tell my students that the artifacts we create along the way are very important and simultaneously they don't matter. They're in the service of telling a story. The core of design is this thinking and choice making, decisions that we make as human beings who are thoughtful and informed about what it is we're designing for. So what? I've talked about design thinking, given you some little background as a teacher. I wanted to share something that we could all take away, but I'm also doing this with a little bit of hope. This is what I'm carrying around as I start working with tools that I haven't really even conceived of yet with my class. And I think we're just starting to see it with Figma. So I wanted to just share 3 broad principles that I'm carrying with me as I develop my curriculum for this semester, which I'm still working on, and how I suspect I'm going to need to be thinking about design going forward. And even if you're not a UX designer, I think this can be useful. The first is to start with people and paper. And this is just exactly what we see in that design process that I shared. So in this image here, this is one of my classes. My students are doing an ideation exercise. This actually was led by my buddy Burton Rast, who spoke earlier. We got together and using an IDEO technique that specifically asks participants to draw a picture and write words with marker on a Sharpie and open up to each other and talk about ideas is really, really useful and helpful. And when students start this ideation, they've already spoken with people because we do a bit of research, whatever kind of design that we're working on. I had my students redesign the Muni ticket kiosks last year. Well, we started by visiting the Muni ticket kiosks and seeing how people use them, especially now when a lot of folks are using their phones and not buying tickets in traditional ways. We went and observed them, came back and got together in physical space with physical sticky notes, started ideating. So start with people and paper. And I mean this in the broadest sense, from research to ideation with actual people and using sticky notes, but also using paper by creating sketches, which kind of leads me to my second point. Before we start writing prompts, I think it's really important to not just meet with people and discuss ideas with people, but to work with paper and sketches. So here are some students, as I recall, they're working on a project for an interactive board that allowed people to, I think it's called the Kanban board. It's a method of working where you have different roles, and it's a cool system for office and collaboration of folks working together. And they're creating a tangible interface that's going to exist on a wall to help people manage this system. And before they started doing anything with their computers, I really insist that they take a minute to step back, and instead of looking at a blank computer screen, to instead look at a blank sheet of paper or a blank whiteboard and actually start working with sketches, no matter how crude, before they start thinking digitally. And when they have those sketches and they have this interaction with other human beings informing their ideas, they can use those sketches to inform future systems. So Figma just showed a text to wireframe. It reminds me a little bit about what we just learned about how we can provide guardrails to image generation, right? I don't see it being very far away where we could provide some text prompts on how we want a system to work, and maybe also some of our first few crude sketches of how we want it to look and feel. Multimodal interactions with AI is something that I think we're going to hear about a lot. But don't just jump in with a prompt, sketch out an entire process. What I'm not showing you here is that my students don't start thinking about making wireframes in demos until they've used physical Sharpies and paper to not just draw a quick wireframe, but to draw each state of the app or interaction that they're drawing. To think through something all the way. It's a time-based experience, not just a single frame. So they've thought through the interactions and affordances they need on paper. Then they can start working with AI. And I find this is a much more successful way to work than, I suspect, just jumping into AI. So the third thing is that one demo is not enough. This is a student, I talked to you about redesigning the Muni ticket kiosk. This is a student, not only do they do work in Figma, but if they're designing something tangible like a ticket kiosk, I want them to get a sense of the scale and how it feels to interact with it in a quick and dirty prototypey way. So we get off of screens and start to use projection, just projecting onto cardboard to make prototypes that people can move around and interact with. And often when students do this, they'll get some really good feedback, and I'll tell them, awesome, go make another one. And they get kind of crestfallen because they've just spent so many hours creating this one prototype with all the research that they've done and all the ideation that they've done, that when I tell them to go back and think through 2 or 3 more, so they have a spectrum of choices to make as designers and collaborators, they get a bit nervous. Oh, thank you. Thank you. You're on top of it. They get a bit nervous. And this is where I think when we pursue these new systems, and I do think this is inevitable even though Figma put this on pause for a moment, it now means that we as designers, more is expected of us. More is expected of my students. When I know that with well-informed prompts backed by research and sketches, they can create a demo in maybe a couple hours, where in the past it might take them a couple days to do all the work to create a demo. Well, that doesn't mean they just get to make 1 or 2 demos and then move on. That means that I expect them to make 3, 5 demos and form an opinion about what they think is best. So 1 demo is not enough. We need several. And right now, that's difficult for students, particularly as they're just beginning to learn. But with tools like this, it allows me to ramp up my expectations of them. So I gave a presentation. When I first started teaching with AI, I was using it in a creative coding context rather than a visual context. And I gave a presentation called my AI Co-Teacher. And I realized I gave AI a little too much credit in this context. I thought that it was a superpower for me as a teacher, but I realized it isn't doing the act of teaching any more than Figma is doing the act of design when we give it a prompt. It's an assistant that empowers us as designers as opposed to doing the design ourselves. So I'm hopeful that just these couple tips, the way we think about how we use these tools as designers, is something that often feels sort of terrifying when anyone can create a record and put it out on the internet, when anyone can create images and prototypes. It's easy as designers and people who are cultivating our taste, our context, our point of view as designers, it's easy to want to give up and feel like our jobs are threatened. But as a teacher of folks who aspire to work in this industry, I'm actually optimistic. I think this gives us incredible powers to be even better designers than we are today. It challenges us to do more and be more thoughtful. If we use it to just do work faster, then I think we're kind of abdicating our role as designers. And that's one of the things I try to leave my students with.